Good morning. This is week 9. And this week, even though we're still kind of tying up imperialism yet again, we're moving into the causes of World War One. And as I kind of explained in my brief setup on the content page, there are some traditional arguments about what the causes of World War One are. We refer to them as Main, M-A-I-N, with each of the letters standing for something. So to try to give you a sense of what this means, I'm going to go through this very quick little PowerPoint I put together, and then we're going to bump over to the discussion question for this week. Now I realize that some of you have probably already started working on this. Hopefully this will help kind of clear it up for you, particularly with that concept of what historiography is. All right, so what is Maine? Well, the of Maine stands for militarism. Militarism was going on throughout Europe and the United States, and actually pretty much throughout the world, especially with, of course, imperialism and trying to keep control of the colonies. As we've already talked about, as you've already seen, the United States had entered the empire building game by this point in time, declaring war on the Spanish. Um, in the wake of that, we gained territories, Guam, Puerto Rico, etc. The Philippines, particularly, which then turned into a whole different war of its own. And because of that, and because of this attitude that we needed to have spaces that we could both use for raw resources, for markets, and for geographic location, the size of militaries grew everywhere, not just in the United States, but again throughout Europe. The problem with that, though, is that when you start investing that much money in your Army and your Navy, Navy being the big one in this period, you want to use them. And that sense of uh, having something that big and that expensive and that powerful, because by this point in time, industrialization had also led to new and different weapons. World War I is kind of a culmination point of some of the most horrific weapons humankind has ever managed to devise. We're not talking about atomic bombs yet. That's the end of World War II. But in this one, you've got these big and very large new weapons that can launch missiles for 100 miles. The whole idea that war was noble and chivalric and it was mano a mano, men fighting to determine who was the stronger, kind of goes out the window in World War One. It gets slogged down in trench warfare. Um, it gets slogged down with these horrific things like gas. This is your gas mask here. These chlorine gas, mustard gas, weapons that destroy you from the inside out, even before you're aware that they're there. Flamethrowers become a big thing, particularly as men are going over the top of trenches or are coming up against armies themselves. I mean, it's a really brutal and horrific war. And this idea, though, going into it that, well, our army's the best and it's the strongest and it's the most well trained and it has the best new technology. This is great, except that they seem to all forget that they've all got the same technology. That a lot of these instruments of war are coming from literally the same places. All right, so militarism, one of the first ones. The alliance system itself, this is the A of Maine. These alliances were ones that had been put in place over the course of the preceding 100 years. It's this idea, again, that you owe someone trade rights to start with. That's where a lot of the alliances start, is with trade ventures, but then later becomes alliances for self-protection. At the end of the 1800s, well, in the 1870s, France and Germany, and it wasn't even Germany at that point in time, it was basically Prussia, had gotten into a war. France had ended up losing. At the end of that war, though, Germany and Italy both unified. So we can stop talking about them as uh, areas that are controlled by other places. Now they're their own governments, but they also are looking like everybody else to acquire more territories of their own. So the alliance system is a big part of what happens that escalates World War One, in that it starts off as literally what was supposed to be thought of as the Third Balkan War, another little war right down here in Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria, that area, areas that had formerly been parts of the Ottoman Empire, that had now been working to become independent, but that had been fighting with each other over their own territories. Um, when World War I starts, literally, we tend to think of it as the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, um, but that happens in April. It's actually not until August that the war starts, and a big part of that is because of the drawing together of all the alliances, of everybody making sure that the people they think they've got on their side are actually going to be on their side. And probably the best example of this, of course, is with the blank check, which is this idea that Germany basically said to Austro-Hungary, sure, we'll back you up. You want to go at this, you want to take on and annex Serbia. We know Russia has promised to protect them, but inversely, we're good with going to war with Russia. Um, and certainly would be good with going to war with France because we'd like to put France back in their place again. So this alliance system is literally what takes the 4 months from April till August for the war to start. And it really is all of these guys getting their ducks in a row and making sure everybody's on the same side. But it's also a matter of these particular countries, each one thinking at some point one of the others is going to back down. And in fact, there's an argument that when Germany actually said to Austria-Hungary, sure, we'll back you up, they actually had thought that that would prevent the war because that sort of permission had worked in the past as a mechanism for delaying war or making your allies feel comfortable enough that they could find some other way to negotiate. So the alliance system is the other big thing. And if you watch there are several crash course videos in their World History 2.0 or their second series of World History, where they talk about exactly that, the timing of how these things come together and what actually each country may have thought the other country's diplomats meant going into this war. Those are very interesting. They're not required for this week, but I do encourage you to watch them if you're still kind of curious as to literally the kind of domino effect of the alliance system. All right, now the I in Maine can be one of two things. Traditionally, it's imperialism, which is why I list imperialism here as I number one, but it can also be industrialization, which I think of as I number two. So I'm going to hit you with imperialism first. Now, obviously, we've been talking about imperialism for several weeks now, so this is not a new concept to you. What is new and what's on our board right here is this area. It's imperialism over this part of Central Europe called the Balkans. Now, most of the European empires have territories spread throughout the world. Obviously, France, Britain, and even Germany do. The scramble for Africa in the late 1800s had moved a lot of European powers into colonizing Africa itself, but a lot of them still also have control of areas in the South Pacific, in Asia, and in the Western Hemisphere. It is Austro-Hungary and Russia and the Ottoman Empire that are central to this problem with imperialism because these guys have not expanded into areas outside of Europe. Instead, they've spent literally centuries fighting over these provinces. And in fact, many of the problems we have today stemming from the Balkans, that little genocidal thing that happens in the 1990s, a lot of that was a consequence of almost 500 years of fighting over these territories. And one faction, for example, the Serbs, finding themselves allied with one of the empires, in this case, Russia. They spoke similar languages. They shared a similar religion. Whenever Russia had control of any part of the Balkans, it was the Serbians who were considered to be their go-to people in that area to help them keep control. The Ottomans have a similar problem. The Bosnians would be the ones that they would go to. The Bosnians would adopt Islam like the Ottomans, and that would make them the go-to people. Inversely, for the Austro-Hungarians, the Croats, and several other groups that adopted Catholicism would be their go-to people. So this is part of why there are so many tensions in these areas. The Serbs, the Bosnians, the Bulgarians, the Romanians, all of these guys now, though, are looking to become independent. And again, that's a big part of what starts World War I with the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, is that independence wasn't happening fast enough for some factions. They still felt that they were being too heavily influenced by the previous control of either the Austro-Hungarians or the Russians or the Ottoman Empire. So this imperialism, the fact that these three guys, these three big empires still want to control those areas, is a big part of the competition leading into World War I. And as we know, of course, it's that assassination and the fact that Austro-Hungary wants to take Serbia back into its territory to annex it as punishment for the assassination. This is a big part of why the Serbs look to Russia, and the whole alliance system thing then falls into place, right? All right. The other I, again, industrialization, which of course has really shifted the dynamics of economics. Again, with imperialism, it's not just enough that you control territory. As an empire, you want to take the raw materials from that area and bring them back to your home country, your home base, the mother country, convert them into finished goods, and then sell them back. But it's also this industrialization which plays into this ability to create these massive weapons and the shells. I mean, this is what part of this image is. These are military weapons, military missiles, effectively, that are being created and being mass produced. So this is another big thing that's driving the war effort itself, is this idea that, well, we can, go have this quick little war, pretty much everybody in the major empires in Europe are saying, hey, it's fine. It's August. It's going to be a short, quick little war. We're going to be decidedly vigorous or victorious. We'll all be home by Christmas. So it's quite a shock when, of course, the war bogs down at the end of the first 3 months and nobody is home for Christmas. The other thing with industrialization is that as it draws closer to war, it becomes also kind of a class issue, which we'll talk about in a minute when we get to nationalism. But this idea of many industrial workers, we talked about how bad industrialization was for the workers, but this idea of war kind of gives them something to look forward to, the idea that they can take more territories and maybe make more money, that they can shift things that will make it of benefit to their nation if they win. And if they win, then that, will better their standard of living, which then, of course, brings us to nationalism. And nationalism seems somewhat contradictory to imperialism, but you're getting two sides of nationalism. You're getting the nationalism of the people who were colonized, like the Bosnians, the Serbians, and even as the war goes on, the Southeast Indians in India, the people in Southeast Asia, because everywhere that colonies are up against each other, depending on who's controlling it, those people are fighting too. And as you'll notice from one of the required videos for this week, the main European players all call up the people from their colonies to serve and fight in Europe for them. So it's a really interesting thing that these colonized peoples learn by being exposed to the Europeans themselves. Many of them come back from the war with this idea that, hey, they're actually not any better than we are. We should certainly be able to govern ourselves. So that's going to lead to a lot of the emergence of nationalism in colonial territories. But again, also within the nations themselves, where it really does become a matter of my country is better than that other country. This particular image is, of course, from the United States. After the United States comes into the war, towards the end of it, there's still a big push on the part of the country to encourage people to support the nation, in this case by buying war bonds in order to fund the military and to fund the war. But that's just one example of the kind of nationalism that's going to go on. It's very much this idea that each nation has of its own superiority to the other ones around it. All right, so that's Maine. Militarism, the alliance system, imperialism and industrialization, and nationalism. These are the 5 big points in the traditional view of the causes of the war. Now, with that in mind, let's go to the discussion for this week. All right, so you've got these 3, and here we go down towards the end at the bottom, these 3 required readings and sources. Now, as I mentioned earlier, you've got an extra credit quiz to take, and the questions on that quiz are multiple choice, fill in the blank, true, false, and they're based, all 10 of the questions are based on these sources. The first one, the Beck piece, is actually an essay, but the other 2 are videos, and I encourage you to watch them. Well, I don't encourage you to watch them, they're kind of required for the discussion itself. But getting back to the discussion, the key one here, the last one, is the one down here, right here. The Roads to World War One. In it, Green is arguing that our traditional reasons for the war, may not be what actually caused the war. And that in itself is this idea of historiography, this idea that we um, have taught history a certain way, and then later somebody comes along and comes up with a different idea or different sets of explanations. Historiography, the way we tell the story of history, quite often based on the perspective of the people living there at the time. And I will point out that one of the big things that Green talks about is the uncertainty that existed in Europe and throughout the world at the end of the 1800s and going into the 1900s. And in fact, he focuses a lot on that as being one of the chief motivations. And that these other things are just reflections of that uncertainty, if not causes of that uncertainty. And that in itself breeds a climate where war becomes inevitable. So I encourage you again to watch the videos, obviously. And as we get close to this, the beginnings of World War One, take into account everything that you are reading this week and everything that you've read for the past several. All of the chapters in the textbooks, whichever one you have, are kind of sifting all of these ingredients together to get you there. So, all right, with that in note, if you have questions, email me. Otherwise, I look forward to your discussion posts.